My name is George. I'm here to speak no on F. I think everyone at this point knows how the city defines a short-term rental. Is that the case? So a stay of less than 30 days. It could be a spare room in your home. It could be an in-law unit. It could be an entire unit if it's less than 30 days. The current laws have a cap of 90 days if you're not in your home, if you're not physically there. So if you're on vacation, for example, you want to share your home while you're away. This helps bring in extra cash for people in a very real, meaningful way in San Francisco at a time when costs are rising. It brings businesses, shops, local businesses and cafes, business in areas of the city that they might not otherwise benefit as much from travelers. And it brings about $1 million a month in tax revenue to the city under the current regulations. So the city in February 1st was when the city's regulations took effect. And then in July, the Office of Short-Term Rental was created as a means of sort of strengthening enforcement, right? Getting more serious about enforcement and having a more focused, structured way of carrying that out. Tax revenue, I talked about that. That goes to fund city priorities like parks, libraries, firefighters union, etc. We see Prop F as a measure that takes the regulations to an unnecessary extreme for three basic reasons. We do see Prop F as something that encourages neighbors to file suit against each other. It's not so. It's that neighbor that's always complaining about something. We see Prop F as giving them an easy vehicle to create a litigious situation for a profit. Right? The city doesn't have to actually find an issue. Right? There's a requirement under Prop F that the city review, but regardless of what the city says, the individual can proceed with a lawsuit after waiting 90 days. They can file a complaint anonymously. They can file it over the phone anonymously. They don't have to provide evidence. They can just say, I think there's something going on next door. I think it has to do with short-term rental. So we think that offers an unprecedented and very easy vehicle for lawsuits. It bans Prop F bans the short-term rental of in-law units in San Francisco, which hurts people particularly of color and of lower income. And we are concerned about the fact that it requires hosts to file quarterly reports with personal information, like where they're, if they're sleeping at their home at particular nights or not. If you're registered under Prop F, if you're registered as a short-term rental host, but you're only engaging in short-term rental for a brief period each year, you still have to file a report each quarter, documenting basically where you are, what you're doing at your own home. With regard to lawsuits, I think I hit the main points. I'd love to entertain questions from you. With regard to in-law units, same, and I'm just trying to go fast because I know we've limited time. And we're particularly concerned, again, about this issue of privacy. That's one of the reasons we've been endorsed by a police union, by a consumer watchdog, by the mayor, by the Democratic Party of San Francisco, by the firefighters union, by the Alice B. Toklas Club, and by Parent PAC. So I'd love to take your questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're talking about more lawsuits, but your example was calling, I gather, a city or two cities, who they call, but the neighborhoods.
311 probably.
Yeah, who do they call? That doesn't sound like a lawsuit.
So originally the planning department asked for enforcement of this law when it was when it first came into effect, and then the Office of Short-Term Rental now takes primary authority for enforcing short-term rental laws. So that's who that presumably would be who we call.
But that's not a lawsuit. So I just want to understand the language.
It turns into a lawsuit as a process. So you pick
by
up
the complainant?
you pick up the phone, you say there's a short-term rental violation going on next door to me. You don't have to provide evidence. You don't have to, it can be anonymous. Then you have to wait 90 days for the city to make a determination. But unlike the current regulations that require that the city evaluate the case and say, we think there's merit or not, Prop F doesn't require the city's determination to be in the affirmative for the lawsuit proceeding.
Yes, I have a question. So, say I rent out my living space through Airbnb. Am I then, or aren't I then, a sole proprietor? And therefore wouldn't, like any sole proprietor, having to do certain filings with personal information and personal data then be an acceptable and appropriate requirement?
So under the current laws, you do have to register, and you do have to prove that it's where you live, it's your primary residence. But you only have to report on when you're engaging in home sharing activity. You're not locked into filing a quarterly report each quarter, regardless of whether you're home sharing during that time or not. That's the difference.
Yeah, I I see the difference. I'm wondering, like, even if I'm not engaging in an activity, but I still may, then wouldn't I still be a sole proprietor if I haven't opted out of the program? See what I'm saying?
I understand what you're saying. I would say that when you're, under the current laws, once again, when you're engaging in that business activity, then you report on how many nights you have a guest in your home on your short-term rental. Other questions?
Okay, a couple of fast questions. How much bankroll is Airbnb putting into the No on That campaign? And two, if you're opposed to the regulations offered, proposing opt-out, what would be more stringent regulations and what would currently have that would be acceptable?
We think the regulations that are in place are among the strongest in the country, and the fact that they've been in place for a very short period of time, I think says something about a need to give them some time to work, particularly in light of the Office of Short-Term Rental having just been created as a way of carrying it out. But Prop F, because it's ballot box legislation, means that in order to make any changes, if we see Prop F as being very poorly written, okay? And so we think that for that reason there can be unintended consequences down the road and some mistakes that we need to be worked out. But because it's a proposition on the ballot, the Board of Supervisors can't go and make changes in the way that they could if it was policy created by the board in the first place.
And to the first question?
Yes, there is major funding of the No on Earth campaign by Airbnb.
How much?
I don't have the precise number in my head.
More than half?
It's been, it's all on file with the Ethics Commission. More than half, yes.
Can I just slip in on one quick question? So the tax revenue for the city that they're getting, is that coming from the people renting out the space, or is that coming from Airbnb?
Airbnb made the decision to pay the hotel tax on behalf of its hosts. But every time someone stays in a short-term rental situation in a home, it's subject to the hotel tax, just in the way that a normal lodging accommodation would.
I do actually think the public policy questions regarding this measure are probably the most important aspect of it. From our perspective with Proposition F, short-term rentals for short-term profit are hurting the long-term health of our city, specifically our housing stock. And in all honesty, we didn't want to be here in front of you right now. We had this petition ready last year, knowing that this issue was an ongoing one for the city. For many of you who should know, before February of this year, short-term rentals were completely illegal in the city and county of San Francisco, and nothing was done. So we waited for then Supervisor David Chu's legislation. He met with Airbnb lobbyists 75 times. And they came up with a piece of legislation that the planning department called wholly unenforceable. So as a result of that, there was round 2 of the Board of Supervisors earlier this summer. We waited again, took the recommendations from the planning department, the budget analyst, and that's part of Proposition F, and we waited for the Board of Supervisors to improve the legislation that had been deemed unenforceable by their own planning department. They actually made the legislation worse. So we moved forward with Proposition F. It does a few things. Mainly, and some if not all of these recommendations come from the Planning Department's own recommendations to the Planning Commission earlier this year in an April memo. Namely, there's a limit on the number of days and nights that you can have a short-term rental for 75. That's capped. That is all rentals. That is not hosted or unhosted. The recommendation of the Planning Department was to eliminate that category and just call everything short-term rentals. So we did that. The most important part is it creates a mandate that hosting platforms like Airbnb cannot list unregistered, unlicensed short-term rentals. Right now, Airbnb has 5,400 listings. Do you know how many of them are actually registered with the city? 600. 88% of their listings are illegal, and yet the city and county cannot do anything about it because it's not part of the current law. Third part that the Proposition F deals with, mandatory reporting. Not from the hosts, which is under the current law. It's up to the hosts to self-identify if you're registered, 88% of them are not, and tell the city how many nights they've actually had a short-term rental. Under Proposition F, it's the hosting platforms who are responsible to say to the city, here are the units, here are the places, these are the short-term rentals, and there's how many nights they've done so you can actually have track. Without that, there's no way of enforcing this at all. And the last, and I'm sure the opposition loves to make a lot of this, is the private right of action. For those of you who are aware, it's a very simple concept and one common in many laws in California. What that means is, in specific to Proposition F, the only thing we've added to the current right of action that already exists within the legislation is expand that to neighbors and interested parties. What that means is, you live in an apartment building, your downstairs neighbor seems to have a short-term rental, there's no registration at the city, they're not registered, there's no information about it, you didn't know, there's lots of noise, whatever your complaint happens to be. You file that with the city has 90 days to take action on that. After the 90 days, if the city has taken no action on the complaint that you have what is called a private right of action to then sue, to make sure that essentially the city does its job. The city always reserves the right to sue. This actually extends it to the citizens to ensure that there actually is an enforcement process, which currently doesn't exist. Those are the primary fundamentals of Proposition F. For those who understand this issue, it's, I would say, one of the largest and most important public policy issues that's facing the city. We are currently cannibalizing our housing stock for short-term profit and for high-paying tourists. It makes no sense. The Planning Department's memo said that there were 4,600 units that were either entire units or entire homes. This is not home sharing. This is taking whole units off the market for short-term use for high-paying tourists. It makes no sense. So 4,600 units are entire apartments, entire homes. Do you know how many units we actually built as a city last year? 3,500. We are taking off the market more units than we're actually constructing. In the midst of the worst housing crisis the city has faced in the last 50 years. It's mind-boggling that we continue down this road, and yet we do. So, part of the coalition that's supporting Proposition F, and it's very rare for me to be able to say, A, I'm on the same side as Dianne Feinstein and the Apartment Association, but also the Sierra Club, Labor Council, Mark Leno, Tom Amiano, and all the housing groups in the city who understand what this issue means and making sure that we ensure that our valuable housing stock is actually used for residents who live here, not for tourists who are visiting. And I'm sure there's lots of interesting questions.
Wow. So I'm going to take Jeff first.
What's all this stuff about in-laws? I haven't heard. I didn't see that.
Yes. So one aspect, if you remember, last year, beginning of this year, they legalized in-laws.
Yeah.
So the whole point of bringing this is under Proposition F, you cannot use in-laws for short-term rentals. The reason being, very specifically, is we legalized those units in the first place to bring it into the housing stock, not to have that same stuff actually removed and used for short-term tourists. It makes absolutely no sense.
I believe that was Scott Wiener's law.
Yes!
So is he for this or against this?
He's against this. It is mind-boggling. Trust me. It is, yes.
They shouldn't be doing that in the first place, right? I mean, they shouldn't be doing that in the first place. Until a few months ago, it was illegal to even have an in-law, right?
Right, and so we've actually spent this whole time crafting legislation.
Right. They spent 2 years to legalize having in-law apartments so that they could increase the housing stock, and now they're saying.
Yeah, they essentially created consumers for private.
Yeah, I mean, and here's the thing, and it's interesting, I was actually asked yesterday by clearly someone who opposed the measure, what if there's a situation where you had to rent to your in-laws, your actual in-laws, for 30 days of the year, but it could only be 30? I'm like, absolutely. There's a needle in a haystack situation where this might possibly apply. But the idea that we would actually take units that we just put into the system and take them back out again is, makes no sense.
So Quentin, say a little more on the private right of action, because the opponent guy is scaremongering about lawsuits, and I asked him to clarify lawsuits by whom, to whom, blah, 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 and he was very vague. Here's my question is, in this time limit, so you said 90 days or something?
90 days after you file a complaint with the city.
Then who does the neighbor sue? So right of action, okay, so a neighbor, to me that's not a big deal. Anyway, the neighbor gets right of action to sue the city for not enforcing the law, or what? Say more.
Yeah, so they would then sue the three. It's a weird kind of a weird scenario. It's kind of through the city to the actual neighbor who's violating the law if they're unregistered or otherwise. The city always reserves that right. And you also have the right to sue the hosting platform. Yes.
Ooh.
So that's where the dig is the hosting platform themselves, right? So then they can actually say to Airbnb, right, we're actually we're suing you as a citizen because you have broken the law. We're shifting the responsibility from the host to the hosting platform. So no longer can they say we have no control over who puts stuff on our website. We're actually saying you're the actual hosting platform and you actually have to take responsibility for it. Absolutely. So the question, and I think the scaremongering is going to continue. But very clearly, I think any of you saw the article in the Chronicle that ran this weekend about private right of action. Carolyn Said did one. But very clearly, they talked to lawyers, and to actually, so the opponents would have you believe that it's going to cause neighbors suing neighbors and lawsuits out the wazoo, everything.
Because everyone has enough money to get a lawyer.
Exactly right. But here, the case that was made by any lawyer that you talk to, which is that you have to prove, no lawyer takes on that case unless you can prove a case that says, like, no one just walks and says frivolous lawsuit because it's expensive. It's not easy. Unless you're going to win, there's no way you're going to do that process.
Yeah, his term was logarithmic litigiousness.
Oh,
yes.
So listen, I can't compete with that. That's just,
Oh, yeah.
We're also going to cause the apocalypse. So just in case you're wondering, in addition to the
He
litigation.
wasn't quite apocalyptic.
Yeah, although he did fess up that Airbnb did fund at least half the proposition.
So just a last question, and actually speaking of what Peter said. So oftentimes what I've witnessed is the righteous campaigns just don't have the money.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I know you've been involved.
On many righteous cheap campaigns. That's
where, had the moral high ground and worked hard.
Yeah.
But couldn't get the message out. Is this campaign going to have the money to compete come November with the direct mail and community outreach?
I mean, I think not in the sense of this. We will compete. We'll have at least $500,000, if not more.
That's enough.
I think the challenge is, as you've seen, Airbnb can afford, it's $1 billion corporation. So the question is whether or not they reach PG&E's limit of, I think, 10 or 11 million when they fought Public Power in 2008. We'll see. It'll at least be several million.
Yeah.
So on that sense, the volume we won't be able to compete with, we actually do think we'll be able to get our message out there.
Yeah, $500,000 sounds like enough.
Yeah, we think that's fair enough for a pretty strong mail program and just sort of general outreach otherwise. But we'll see. I think as you've seen, they've hired some very high-powered White House consultants and Democratic operatives to come in here to run this.
So you're going to get Dianne Feinstein to do a commercial locally?
We believe she's going to do that. It's very interesting. As context, the biggest critique that we got was from the senator who said that we were being too soft. It's very funny. I will point out that some of the...
I thought I was misreading when I read the SF Elections guide that said she's an opponent of... she's a supporter. I can't believe it.
In fairness, one thing she's always supported is quality of life of the city. She loves this city. I know what her politics are.
Well, no, and it's very funny because...
This is not inconsistent for her.
It's one thing if, to Glenn's point, right, I've certainly worked on very progressive campaigns, right, where it's only the progressives, etc. When you have the apartment association and Dianne Feinstein, the folks actually get this issue. It's very funny to have the opposition call us too extreme. So I'm like, the last thing Dianne Feinstein is too extreme. Anyone who knows that, right, like she actually read the ordinance, right? So it's like...
I actually I called someone up to say, is this true?
Is it true, right? Is there a huge typo in the elections book?
But then it does make me say, okay, that's the big gun here.
That's the big gun. That is the big gun.
Is she contributing to the campaign? Is she giving money?
Well, she's doing more than giving money. She's fundraising for us. Yeah. Which is probably the most important answer.
I
just have a little, your opponent, one of the charges he threw out is that Proposition F is poorly crafted. He didn't refer to the fact that it had been under consideration for over a year.
Right.
What do you suppose he had in mind? What are they saying that's bad?
The ease of being at any time on the no side is you toss enough things at the wall, stuff sticks in some people's minds, right? What's interesting about it is all of the recommendations specific to, aside from the 75 nights, came from the planning department's recommendations to actually the planning commission and the board of supervisors. When they said you have to have enforcement mechanisms, actually the tracking, the monitoring, and so we took all those recommendations and just sat there and waited. And clearly City Hall didn't want to listen to anything that we had to say about it, which is very unfortunate. And the fact that, it's interesting, the other night, we presented at the Richmond district. I don't know if it was the same guy who was the opposition, but people said to him afterwards, Quentin gave very specific facts, like numbers. When you say those numbers, he talked about the units that have been pulled off the market. Well, they're from a third-party source. The city and county has now been downgraded to a third-party source. It was like, really? Like, how have we now said city government actually, they're liars. Like, it's a third-party source. You can't trust them. So.
Yeah, usually that's the credible source, right?
Well, that's the only source we feel like we can go on. But here's the other thing. I'll leave you with one last note. What's interesting about the number question, and which I'm sure I know that they can't answer, which is the planning department actually had to hire a data scraping firm to go into each of the hosting sites to try and pull down data because they will not share the information with the city and county. We can't even get exact numbers because they won't share. So in the midst of this whole thing, they're not helping solve the problem. They're actually just sort of holding on to what they have and fighting back and saying, we're not going to give it up even in the midst of all this.
So the sharing economy is not sharing.
We're not getting the sharing, yeah.
I have a quick question. The legislation that was passed by the board, is there any enforcement in it at all?
No, the model that the city is going with, so we have now created an Office of Short-Term Rentals, which is yet to be staffed. And it's a complaint-based process, which means the city does no investigations on their own unless you, as a citizen, go down to the planning department, to the desk, to file a complaint. So it's based on complaint-driven. So they can go weeks, and if no one calls and no one says you should go look at something, the city won't look at anything. Airbnb is not mandated to report any information. They're not mandated to report how many nights someone has rented something. And they're not mandated to share any data with the city and county. So there's literally no enforcement whatsoever. And there's no fines about. The main other issue is the fact that they continue to list unregistered, unlicensed units. 80-some% of them are patently illegal right now.
Oh, which is kind of funny, given that your opponent made it sound as if reporting on the possible illegal unit made them turn out to be snitches or narcs.
Welcome to our city, right? Yeah. You try and save housing, and you're a snitch or a narc. It's great.
Excuse me, but what is to prevent the listing of unregistered units? What is the?
So in Proposition F,
yes.
Airbnb can be, or any other hosting platform can be fined. So you go and say there's only 600 and we see 5,400 listings. You either pull off those listings or you face a fine for each of the individual listings that you are putting up there that are unregistered. So there's actually a stick. The stick is they owe money for every day that they list an unregistered unit.
But there's no investigation, you said.
No, there doesn't have to be an investigation under our model, right? Which is the onus is on Airbnb to follow that. There is actually a very particular stick that says the city can prosecute and fine Airbnb for this and any hosting platform. There actually are 60 other companies. I know this has been framed as an Airbnb measure, but that is the bulk of the market, but there are actually other companies.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Currently, I don't know, it fluctuates between 20 to 25 veterans a day are dying from suicide, neglect, drug abuse, whatever you call it. They're not getting psychiatric help. And if you remember back during the Iraq War, they had congressional hearings, and I believe it was Senator Boxer, or I can't remember who it was. It was a female senator, and she asked the general, they had been asking the general, how many trucks do we have? Oh yeah, this was after they found out the troops didn't have armor, body armor.
Oh.
Okay, that's fiasco. Anyway, so the thing is that they were grilling the general, and he was telling them how many trucks they had, how many tanks, whatever, man. You know, it sounded like, wow, this guy's giving away classified information, telling how many trucks and stuff we have, how many armor, you know, the soldiers have. But then the question came to, they asked him, how many psychiatrists are deployed in the Middle East to help our troops? And you could see the general was nervous. You know, he fumbled around. He talked to his assistant, his lawyer assistant, and I imagine the lawyer told him, shut up and act dumb. And he retorted, he said, oh, well, I don't know the answer to that question. You'll have to ask the experts. Probably because they had hardly any psychiatrists in the Middle East. So anyway, the thing is that turns out they did it. But you see how they dodged the question, the politicians, the political generals. They dodged the question by saying they didn't know. Well, they didn't have it. And now we have like 40,000 American troops coming back from Iraq, they have psychiatric disorders, they have physical disabilities, have chronic pain, whatever. They have all this stuff, problems that are ailing them, and they're never going to be addressed because veterans don't have the right to sue the U.S. government. As soon as a few lawsuits go through and they take massive hits, then they correct the issue. Okay, I'm talking about, okay, say for instance, James Garner, back in 1950, he filed a lawsuit against the U.S., he thought he could file a lawsuit against the U.S. government because they amputated his wrong leg. He had diabetes. Well, anyway, make a long story short, it came back down, the Supreme Court said they didn't have jurisdiction, they didn't want jurisdiction, so he lost his case. So anyway, the thing is that to this day, it took him 1950 to 2014, it took them 60 years. So a few years ago, they made a policy at the VA that you have to mark the part of the body that's going to be amputated. It took 60 years. Oh, when Obama wanted to fire the administrators in Pittsburgh because they didn't do their job correctly and veterans died.
They do it with animals, they use meat markers on animals.
Right. Well, the thing is that this administrator, this director at the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania VA, they couldn't fire him. It wasn't legal to fire the guy. Anyway, the thing is, they gave him a promotion, an award, a bonus, and they transferred him. So anyway, the thing is, they're not going to change their ways if you're giving them promotions. They're totally unaccountable. I'm pretty sure the NSA is more accountable than they are.
And once you give somebody power like that, it's hard to take it away from them again.
No, as usual, they get carried away. But the thing is that Obama, he needed congressional approval to fire that guy. So wow, you have to rewrite the Constitution to help a veteran that got screwed over? I mean, come on now. Anyway, I brought these two books so people can read them and become informed about how the government really does things. You know, the thing about, here, Pretext to War. It talks about how Dick Cheney shuffled the intelligence and we ended up losing on that one. Well, you know that, Iraq lost. But the U.S. has been not really doing well with wartime strategy. Besides John McCain saying that ISIS is a moderate group, I mean, you expect Republicans to spew out garbage like that. But the thing is, we had a tie in Korea. That's a draw. It's still going on. In Vietnam, we lost that one. You know, we won all the battles but lost the war because of politics. And the big threat then was supposed to be the big domino theory. The scary communists are going to take over the whole Asia, right? Remember the domino theory?
Yes, yes.
So now Vietnam's a capitalist nation, so is China. So I don't understand. What does it matter if they're capitalist, communist, socialist?